Today I'll be taking a closer look at the recently revisited Masters of the Universe line, or Masters of the Universe Origins, from Mattel. Now, Masters of the Universe is a line that has been revisited many times across the years since its initial conception back in the early 1980s. There's been many attempts to revitalise, revisit, update, and reimagine these once very popular toys and characters. But what's interesting about this line is that Mattel are clearly revisiting the original concept and utilising those early designs, tapping in strongly to nostalgia, and then ever so slightly tweaking the original articulation design. Now, I have to admit, Masters of the Universe is a line that just ever so slightly predated my own childhood. So I was never caught up in the fever of collecting these figures or really aware so much of what all the fuss was about. But my older brothers had been, and they had some of these figures still lying around, so for me there was a certain mystery attached to these figures. I didn't really know who the characters were or what the history was. There wasn't a supporting cartoon when I was growing up to really fill me in, and really the only reference I had was pretty much the movie starring Dolph Lundgren, which of course has a very different aesthetic and feel to it. But as an adult, I've grown to appreciate and understand how significant this line was for toys, and I do think that it represents something quite special. Fantasy toys aren't something you see a lot of, and I absolutely adore artwork like this that was used to heavily promote this line of figures. And it's difficult to undersell just how successful this line was. I mean, look how many characters and vehicles and world-building elements they produced. It's absolutely incredible. And whilst I wouldn't say I'm an avid fan or that I would go all in on collecting a collection of He-Man or Masters of the Universe figures, I really wanted to get hold of a He-Man and a Skeletor, and of course, Battlecat and Panthor, just to scratch that itch that was the sort of mystery surrounding these figures when I was growing up. And there's definitely a part of me that feels like I kind of missed out on something big. So, without much further ado, let's dive in. If we start by looking at the packaging, we can see here they've definitely tried to replicate exactly what was on the shelves back in 1981. Here we can see the original release of He-Man, so as you can see the packaging is exactly the same, the blue, the red, and that pop-out blister packaging there with the figure on display just popping out from the thin card behind it. On the reverse of the Origins release, we can see the other figures in the line, and I believe some newly commissioned artwork. And although the art is new, they've definitely tried to keep the spirit and the feeling of the original artwork, which was so evocative and incredibly vibrant and eye-catching. Skeletor has the exact same packaging at the front, but on the reverse has some unique artwork, which again, very impressive. Out of the packaging, we can see that the He-Man is pretty much an exact replica of what we saw back in 1981, but there's a few little tweaks in terms of the joints in the elbows and in the legs. And as a first time buyer, I have to say I'm really impressed with the colour scheme on this figure. It's really vibrant and colourful and just very fun to look at. The articulation scheme is exactly the same for both figures, but I'll quickly run through it with He-Man. So he's got a ball jointed neck, meaning of course his head can spin from side to side and look up and down. So this obviously is an improvement on the original release, which was just a swivel at the neck. He has ball jointed shoulders, meaning of course that his arms can lift up and out. Again, this is an improvement on the original, which was just a straight swivel. And he's also got that pin swivel at the elbow as well, meaning that his arm can rotate around and it can bend inwards about 90 degrees. It's not a huge range of motion, but it is enough to update the articulation and give you some more options whilst not compromising on the original aesthetic. He also has a swivel and hinge at the wrist as well. Again, the original release just had a moulded hand, there was no articulation in the wrist whatsoever. He does have the same swivel at the waist, but there is no mechanism to snap him back into pole position that the original release had. His ball jointed hips means he can kick his legs out and hold it there, whilst allowing him to kick his legs forwards and backwards a little bit too. Of course, he has the pin swivel at the knee, which allows him to bend his knee to about 90 degrees, and there's also a swivel at his lower calf as well, where it meets the boot, which is fantastic. Of course, this is both new to this release. The 1981 series just had one moulded piece in the leg. And of course, He-Man has one extra little surprise for us here, because he also has a swivel at the foot, at the ankle there, so he can hinge his foot forwards and backwards and move it from side to side. He also comes with a handful of accessories, including his shield, battle axe, and half of the sword of Eternia. He also comes packaged with this mini comic Once again, this is replicating the style of the original releases, because each of the original figures came with a mini story book, and this was because there was no supporting cartoon in place at the time, so they kind of had to world build through this medium. The artwork provided in these mini storybooks were absolutely fantastic, once again capturing that spirit of fantasy art and literature. This update is slightly different. The artwork, of course, is more modern, but with a style that's trying to keep true to the original designs and sort of key spirit of those original releases. They've opted for a comic book format, and oddly, there is no dialogue or words whatsoever. But the artwork is very nicely done, and it does still tell a sequential story. Now, this mini comic book is the same in both figures, so there aren't individual unique stories for each character that you buy, they are all the same. He holds his accessories pretty much perfectly. The battle axe just snaps into his grip there in his right hand, and it looks pretty cool. There's no issues here of the battle axe falling out of his hand or struggling to stay in place. This is a really tight fit. Meanwhile, the shield snaps into place on his left arm and his fingers just loop through the hole there. This isn't quite as great a fit as I would hope, but it works pretty well and it's pretty serviceable. I also love that there's a space on his back there to slide in the battle axe and hold that in place. I think that's a really cool extra feature, which means he can hold all of his weapons at one time. And so here he is wielding the Sword of Eternia with a battle axe on his back and a shield in hand, and I think this is just a fantastic look for He-Man. So, moving on to Skeletor, I've always had a soft spot for Skeletor. I've always thought his design was really kind of cool and intriguing, just that skull face is, very, very creepy. And I think they've done a fantastic job recreating the original release here. The colour scheme is pretty much spot on, and it just looks fantastic. Very vibrant, colourful, and fun. The articulation scheme is exactly the same as He-Man, but I thought it might be worth pointing out a couple of pieces in case you were concerned about the plastic pieces around him. So there's no hindrance here from his shoulder pads. These are a soft plastic which move with the shoulder joint. Likewise, his little belt there, again, there's nothing blocking the articulation, nothing hindering it at all. It's all very soft plastic and very malleable. Skeletor comes with a couple of accessories of his own, including his half of the Sword of Eternia and his staff. Sadly, he can only hold one of these accessories at a time due to the fact that obviously his left hand is an open hand, but he holds them both perfectly well, and they both look fantastic when he is. Now, a quick word about the Sword of Eternia. As I've said, each figure comes with half of the sword. The idea is that you click them together. Now, when I first got these, because I was new to the line, I didn't realise this was a thing. And it wasn't until I looked into the line and the history of it that I realised what this was all about. You see, this all hinges on the key cornerstone piece of this collection, which is, of course, Castle Grayskull, which was the major playset for the line. And on a side note, again, just look at this artwork. It's absolutely magnificent. But before I digress completely, the original design of Castle Grayskull meant that there was an opening in the door. The lock could only be opened by combining the pieces of the sword and turning it as a key. The idea being then that both these characters and their armies would mutually meet and try to be wrestling the other half of the sword away from the opposing lead character. They could then storm the castle, take it over, and they would then have the power of Grayskull, and they would rule Eternia. Now, I think this is a pretty fantastic concept and a really great idea to sustain play. Although I must admit, as a child, I was always convinced that Castle Grayskull belonged to Skeletor because of that big skull and it looked kind of creepy and menacing and a bit evil, really. So it kind of feels like the odds are in Skeletor's favour. Now, both He-Man and Skeletor are incomplete without their loyal steeds. In He-Man's case, this is Battlecat, a giant tiger that is harnessed and ready for battle. Once again, the artwork here is really sumptuous, incredibly evocative, and just very beautifully done. On the reverse, we have some new and original artwork here at the top, which is absolutely fantastic. I mean, look how evocative that image is, it's just wow. And then underneath we can see the other figures and some of the more deluxe items in this line as it's continuing to grow. The same is true of Panthor. He's got his own artwork and his own colour scheme, which is great. Again, the imagery is really strong and vibrant. And he's got some alternative artwork on the back here. Again, I just love the background on this image. It's just incredible. What a wonderful, fantastical landscape. Starting with Battlecat, you'll see straight away, of course, that this figure is scaled up to be perfectly in scale with He-Man. The mould, of course, is significantly updated, and you'll notice there's a fair bit of articulation. The original release was a very static figure that had no movement. It was essentially just a zoo animal repainted. but this is a significant reworking while staying true to the original design. I particularly like how they've added the detail in the eyes there to give a little slit to make it look like this is literally the eyes of Battlecat peering through the armoured helmet. Upon opening the figure, you'll realise he has these plastic elastic pieces keeping the helmet in place. I was initially a little bit concerned that if I remove these, that the helmet would fall off and it would be quite loose, but actually it's very, very rigid, it's very solid, and yeah, you can remove these with confidence. And underneath, we can see, of course, Battlecat's real face, and it looks really solid, looks really good. I think they've done a really nice job of this. The paint apps are nice, and of course he has that hinged jaw as well. I really like the sculpt of this, and I think the paint apps are nice. It would have been nice to have maybe a little bit more of a paint wash over the face there, just to give it a little bit more detail. I appreciate they're trying to stay true to the original, so they don't want to overdo it, but just a little bit here and there, maybe particularly around the eyes, would have been really cool. In terms of articulation then, well, it doesn't take much to beat the original because there was 0. Now he has articulation in his neck, so we can look up and down a good distance. He has it at the top of his head as well. Again, it's a ball joint, meaning he can look up and down within that range, but also from side to side. Here's a close-up of that fantastic hinge joint in the jaw, and yeah, that opens a really good distance, and it looks absolutely brilliant. He's also got articulation in his upper shoulders, meaning that he can kick his legs forwards and out just a tiny bit, not a huge range there, but he can kick them forwards a really good range, which is fantastic. He's also got a pin swivel at the, well, I suppose the elbow, for lack of a better term, which is great. It can actually hinge quite up a good distance there, just fractionally more than 90 degrees. The same is true of the back legs, of course. They can swivel out to the back, and of course they can hinge inwards as well, so this is absolutely fantastic, really pleasant to see. But he's also wonderfully got articulation in the tail, and it doesn't impact too much on the harness either, which is great. So the tail is on a ball joint, meaning it can swivel all the way around and hinge up and down as well, which is, yeah, pretty wonderful. And He-Man slides into place on the back of that harness there, and it is a perfect fit. He-Man feels very snug and secure on there. There's no danger of him wobbling off. He fits in perfectly, and that's just to do with the moulding, which is fantastic. So as you can see, if you shake him about, there's no danger of him just falling off from the side there, which is brilliant. I actually thought he might, but this is really solid. Here we have Panther. It is exactly the same mould, it's just a very different paint job, but it is different enough to look distinctive and with his own personality. Once again, you can slide Skeletor into place, and he is held perfectly in his saddle there, and there's no danger of him falling out of it, and it looks absolutely brilliant when you put these characters together. I tried experimenting with the articulation on Panthor just to see if I put him in different poses, whether that would impact at all on Skeletor, and whether he maybe fall off or just look a bit silly. But thankfully every position I put him in worked really well, and yeah, it just feels like there's a lot of potential for dynamic poses with these characters, and I think he could do some really fantastic displays. So then, final thoughts on these characters and these toys? Well, I have to say, obviously, this isn't really aimed at me. I'm not the original audience that grew up playing with these figures, although I did have awareness of them and a little bit of interest. And I think as an adult collector, for me personally, the articulation scheme could be improved, the moulds could be better, but they've already done an extensive line like this in their Masters of the Universe Classics line, which is pretty cool. The intention with this line clearly is to tap into the nostalgia, so I think if you were part of the original audience who played with these figures as a kid, I think having these tweaks, these updates, are kind of like the perfect match really. They kind of represent the best of both worlds. You're getting the original toy again, but with a slight enhancements to just make them ever so more displayable, a bit more posable, a bit more fun, and I think they've done an absolutely wonderful job of these. So even though I'm not the core audience for these, I do think they're a massive success. I think they're really colourful, they're really fun, and yeah, I think they just look great on display. And if you're into Masters of the Universe or just fantasy in general, then you'd be hard pressed not to appreciate these toys. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.